Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Karina Close. I'm Executive Director of ePluribus Stanford, which is our campus-wide initiative on critical inquiry, constructive dialogue, and engaged citizenship, and delighted to be here with all of you. I want to begin by lifting up some of our heroic students, and Love and Emmett, where are you? Right here in the front. So I want to celebrate that they just led the first ever Indo-Pak Dosti conference right here on campus over the last 2 days. These are students who are responsible really for bringing all of us here together today. And so I want to quote from their mission. "History has been unkind to the people of our subcontinent. It has divided land, it has divided hearts, and for 78 years it has been dividing the vast, unrealized potential of 1.6 billion human beings. All over the world, Indians and Pakistanis meet each other and something remarkable happens. They build together." So it's my great pleasure to introduce today's quarterly Stanford Builders Forum on conflict, dialogue, and bridge building. So a few months ago, Love walked into my office bright-eyed, and he said, "I think Humza and Leo might come." And out of that vision and passion and the connections we build, they've come, and we're so grateful that you came all the way and are here with us today. And were here with us yesterday and the day before. Thank you for being here. So Mr. Leo Varadkar served as Taoiseach, or Prime Minister of Ireland, from 2017 to 2020, and again from 22 to 24. He led the country through Brexit, which, if you remember, was January of 2020. The same time he led the country through COVID at the beginning of that year. Throughout that, he worked hard to preserve an open border with the principal defense of the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. And as a reminder, that's the historic agreement that helped to stabilize the North-South relationships after nearly a century of intractable conflict. He's also the son of an Indian immigrant, and he is the first ethnic minority to serve as Taoiseach in Ireland. He was also the first openly gay minister and then Taoiseach of Ireland, and part of the historic referendum in support of gay marriage. Ireland was the first country to pass that by referendum, demonstrating not only for the people of Ireland, but for all of us, how our strength of relationships can overcome perceived entrenchments, from the rural-urban divide to geographic divides to generational divides and religious divides, and truly achieve unexpected outcomes. Mr. Humza Yousaf served as First Minister of Scotland from 2023 to 24. Prior to that, he served as Justice Secretary and then Secretary of Health. He has also been a member of the Scottish Parliament since 2016, and he was first elected First elected. No, it's coming. He was first elected to regional office in 2011 when he was just 26 years old. Did I get that part right? 26 years old. So indeed, at even a younger age, he was very involved in public and community work. He did join the Scottish National Party in 2005 when he was a university student. Inspired by the anti-war movement, which at that time, as a college student then as well, was Iraq, and encouraged by his father to go into politics and follow your heart. When he was appointed as First Minister on March 29, 2023, he became the youngest person, the first Scottish Asian person, the son of Pakistani immigrants, and the first Muslim person ever to hold that office. Moreover, he is the first Muslim head of any Western democracy. Beyond their individual records, the relationship between these two is instructive and inspiring. In 2023, Leo nominated Humza to the Time 100 Next list of emerging leaders. They went on to work together to strengthen Scottish-Irish relationships. And when the tensions flared again between India and Pakistan last May, the two of them came together to write a letter and jointly advocate for peace and de-escalation in that region. We're so fortunate to also be joined today by Stanford Law School professor Alan Weiner, who leads as the director of the Stanford Center on International Conflict and Negotiation. He brings immense expertise academically and personally related to navigating conflicts all around the world. He is a yes, put me in kind of person, and grateful that he said yes. He's also a talented drummer, so if you ever frequent the Guild in Menlo Park, you might find him there. And he is a doting recent grandfather, and so Thursday evenings are usually when Alan is with his family. So I promised that we'd stick to being on time so he can come back and have dinner with his granddaughter. So we're gonna open it up, I'll turn it over. Then we're going to have an open Q&A after the discussion, and we will do our best to end right at 6:15. And with that, please join me in welcoming all three of our guests today.
Let me echo the welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here. Let me first of all say thank you again to the student organizers. I have been dealing mostly with love. Students are a little bit like, I'm not really sure exactly what the metaphor is. You have them once in class, and sometimes you're never able to let go of them. I had love in a sophomore college class some time ago, and we formed a very nice relationship. And I know Love and his team have done a lot also to Karina for all of your work in organizing these events. I organize enough of these events that I know that this does not happen by itself. So thank you very much for all of your work. I'm extraordinarily grateful to Leo and Humza. We decided we would use first name basis. We would apply California rules. And so I'm very, very grateful for them to have made the trip to come out and to be here with us and to participate in this dialogue. Couple of themes I think that we want to explore over the next hour. The Builders Forum is focused on conflict resolution. I also run a small center at Stanford, the Stanford Center on International Conflict Negotiation. So conflict resolution is one of the things we're interested in. But you're just such compelling characters that we want to learn a little bit more about you. And so I'd like to just begin by saying, the reason why people choose to go into politics, maybe or government or service, may vary from case to case. But in your case, the two of you are path breakers in the sense that your backgrounds are not those of people who had probably traditionally risen to the most senior levels of government in your country, in your countries. And so I'm curious if you can share with us, what motivated you to pursue public service, electoral politics, and to what extent were your identities instructive in that? Was that independent, I want to run for Scottish politics, or was your identity as somebody who was the child of Muslim immigrants? Was your identity as the son of an Indian important in what you decided to do in politics and the issues that you decided to focus on?
Yeah, a couple of questions there.
Many questions.
Yeah, I suppose to start with the motivation, there's one part that I understand and there's one part that I don't. The part that I don't understand is why I was so interested in politics and news and current affairs when I was so young. So I distinctly remember being 6 or 7 years old, going down to vote with my mother in the 1987 general election and being really excited about it all. There's an election happening, there were posters up, it was on the news. I was more interested in elections than football, which is not normal, at least not in Ireland. So I don't really know why that was, other than the fact that my parents would have talked about politics at the dinner table. I would have watched the news with them at night time. I would have been allowed to stay up late to watch Newsnight or Today Tonight or whatever, but that's the bit I don't fully understand, but it was there from very early on. Even though neither were involved in politics, we did talk about politics in the news a lot. The bit that I do understand is something I think very internal. I could never just complain about something and not try to do something about it or make it better. So, I grew up in West Dublin, rapidly growing part of the city, huge numbers of new houses, lots of golf courses but no playgrounds, children going to school in prefabs because there weren't enough school buildings. And I couldn't just complain about that and not try and do something about it. And the same thing then would have gone for the bigger issues that were more national or international. So you'd often hear those conversations. Say when I worked in the health service, I'm a doctor by training, not liking the way it worked, I couldn't just say, the management are rubbish, the government are rubbish, everyone in charge is rubbish. I had to actually try and do something about it. And I'm proud that I was able to achieve certain things in politics in the areas where I failed. At least I know I tried, and I now have a better understanding of the complexity of those problems. I'm pretty sure if I had not run for election, I'd be one of those really angry people on Twitter or writing letters to the paper, just giving out all the time. I'm so glad that didn't happen because I've got that out of my system. On the second part, for me, certainly when I was running for politics initially at the start, my heritage, my mixed race background was not a thing for me. I also wasn't out to myself at that stage, so being gay was not a thing for me. If anything, it was part of assimilation, that I could be just as Irish as anyone else and get elected to office. And grew up in an Ireland that was very homogenous. I was the only brown guy with the funny surname in my class and in school. That's changed a lot now, but that was the case back then. But over time, I actually got to understand how my heritage and how my upbringing was very relevant to my politics. Because from day one, it gave me a very global view that there was a bigger world outside of Ireland. There were people who had different religions, because my mum was Catholic, my dad Hindu, that there were totally different ways of seeing the world. And it was as I matured in politics that I actually started to understand that being of a mixed race intercultural background was a political asset and not something I had to kind of make up for. And I remember meeting President Obama after his term as president in DC, and one thing he said to me, which I hadn't realized to myself, and he said to me, "You and I believe in the kind of things we do because we have to by virtue of our birth. We were the tall kids with the funny names and the brown skin growing up, in his case in Kansas, in my case in Ireland." And that helped me to realize actually a lot of what I do believe about valuing individuals, that everyone's a person, that we live in an interconnected global world, actually has a lot to do with the conditions of my birth, but I didn't see that at first. That came later. Thanks.
Thank you. Can I echo your initial remarks and those of Karina for the fantastic work that Love, Eamon and the team at the Indo-Pak Builders Forum have done. I won't lie to you, it was a very hard sell to convince me to come to one of the most elite, prestigious universities in the world in 20-degree heat and avoid the storms of Scotland, but you did it nonetheless. But it was, no, actually, genuinely, I was inspired by your vision and the fact that you had this incredible idea that had never been done in this university, and I'm not sure has been done in any university in the United Kingdom that I can think of saying, well, we want to try to be the ones who are pushing forward for progress at a time when the world seems to be regressing. And I think that's a phenomenal vision, and you just didn't let anything hold you back, and I'm delighted to be a part of that inaugural conference, so well done to you and the whole team there, and long may it continue. And if I can support your efforts even after this, then of course I'd be delighted to do so. In terms of, so my experience is the exact opposite of Leo's. I was obsessed with football. By that I mean the real football, not the stuff that you guys play, or soccer. But so I was obsessed, and my team, Glasgow Celtic, I supported since I was 5 years old, and still support, though we won't talk about them because they're sitting third in the league at the moment. I did not stay up late watching elections. I stayed up late watching the 1994 World Cup final between Brazil and Italy, where Roberto Baggio, the divine ponytail, missed that penalty. Anyway, we'll skip past all of that to say I was not interested in politics nor current affairs. And in some respects, growing up actually, and I don't think this is necessarily surprising, but I was quite keen to distance myself from my culture, actually, and to a point, even my faith, because I was one of only two people that looked like me in my class. And of course, every young child wants to try to fit it and not be different. And that's quite hard when you're a brown guy called Humza Yousaf with a unibrow and a moustache, age 7. And so you have to try to do your best. And I'm ashamed to say that, actually, because now I'm very proud of my culture and my faith. And then the real change came for me in 9/11. So I was 16 years old at 9/11, viewed myself only as Scottish, refused to speak Urdu, much to my mum's annoyance, refused to embrace the culture, would rather have chips than a chapati, right? I was just as you cut me open and I would bleed blue and white of Scotland, right? And then 9/11 happened, 16 years old. It was on a Tuesday, if my memory serves me correct. We're on the school bus home, obviously with the time difference, we're on the school bus home. And the bus driver, Davey, kind of tells all the kids to shut up because he wants to listen to what's going on the radio. Of course, we ignore him. We kind of hear a little bit of what's going on. And I go home and I watch the same horrific scenes that some of you who were around and alive at that time will have seen. And you'll have been just as shocked and horrified at all of the images that we saw of the planes crashing into the Twin Towers, the people being killed in such a brutal, devastating terror attack. And then I went to school the next day on the Wednesday morning, and I sat beside my two friends, who I'd sat beside all year, and for years actually, in registration class, morning registration class. And they bombarded me with questions about, do you know who flew the planes into the Twin Towers? Why do Muslims hate America? And all I knew was football and all the things that teenage boys talk about. And they weren't doing it with any maliciousness. They just genuinely thought, I must know the answer to that. So for the first time in my life, I went home and I watched news with my dad. 7 p.m., Channel 4 News, with now retired Jon Snow. And I was instantly hooked. I knew that I had to understand more about my faith and my identity, because people are going to keep asking me these questions. And I really embraced it. And much like Leo, there was either we could put our head in the sand and hope that things pass by and that we'd still be able to practice our faith and be who we were after all of this, or we decided to be quite proud of who we were and say, actually, those people don't represent who we are. Islam, by its very virtue, by its very definition, means peace. And actually talk about who we were and what our faith meant. And so that was my entry into kind of current affairs and politics. And then I, when I became elected, decided to take, and I'll finish on this point in a second, that the very opposite advice that Tony Blair's special advisor and communication specialist, Alistair Campbell, said, that Tony doesn't do God. And I thought, well, either I have to be authentic and true because I do God, or I have to hide a huge identity and part of who I am. So I just used to speak about the fact that I'm Muslim and quite proud to be Muslim. And I'll just end it, sorry, I said it, probably shall end at this point, that to the point where, for me, when I became First Minister, it was during Ramadan when the result got announced. And so I said to my family, why don't you come back to the official residence in Edinburgh? It's this wonderful Georgian residence in the centre of Edinburgh, and break fast and have iftar together. And after the iftar, we prayed Maghrib, the sunset prayer, as is tradition and custom. And one of my special advisors was there and he took a photo. And he said, I hope you don't mind, First Minister, I take a photo of you guys praying. You know, just for you, it's a historic moment. There's probably never been an Islamic prayer in Butte House in hundreds of years. And then there was this raging debate between my family about whether to post the picture or not. My cousin saying, come on, fuck's sake, you've been in position for 24 hours. And you know these guys can't, there's a group out there that do not like you, cannot stand you and think you're infiltrating the country, and you want to put a picture of us praying in Butte House in Edinburgh. Are you insane? And then I had the other side of my family saying, but you should normalise the fact that a Muslim First Minister would be praying. That's what you do. There's no shame in it. And so I posted the picture, and it was incredible. It went around the world. People to this day ask me about that picture. But I think people appreciate the fact there was authenticity. And by the way, the other side, of course, said what you'd expect them to say. He's infiltrating and creeping Sharia and all the rest of it. So I suppose to answer your question, it's a very long answer to a very short question, but actually, I think being authentic to yourself, if that is your identity and who you are, and part of what drives your value system, much better to be authentic than to pretend to be something you're not.
Excellent.
I hate to interrupt, but I did learn something here, and I'm not sure. Sport and politics always come together, I think, a lot. And I learned something about Humza I didn't know. You're a Glasgow Celtic fan.
Big time. How did you not know that?
Because it's the Irish Catholic club. So, any particular reason?
My uncle took me to my first game, age 5. But it's interesting. Sorry,
it's probably not true anymore, but historically that was the Irish Catholic club. And Rangers were the Protestant club.
Still very much seen. Yeah. Absolutely.
It's all Ajax here, but we won't go there.
So basically, you're a Catholic Muslim.
Always have been.
The Builders Forum, ePluribus, and then also Stanford Center for International Conflict Negotiation are obviously interested in questions about conflict and conflict resolution. And then at the event that I attended last night, watched your event at the Toasty last night, and heard you talk about the importance of dialogue. So here's a two-part question again for you. For both of you, what would you say have been the most challenging conflicts that you have had to try to navigate in your public life? And then what's the role of dialogue. You know, when I teach my international conflict resolution class, I often warn students, you know, the assumption is that if you get everybody together and have dialogue, that's going to be constructive. But often it's just the opposite, right? Because each side simply rehearses their position and assumes that, well, now I have laid out the arguments why you should agree with me. And when the other side doesn't agree, it can entrench or deepen the conflict. I used to think that you didn't know the facts, but I've just explained them to you quite slowly, and you still don't agree with me. Now I realize there's something wrong with you. You're venal, you're corrupt, right? So how have you found dialogue processes? What role have they played in trying to navigate conflicts?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. Yeah. So on your first part of the question, I think conflict has been, for me, in three parts in the political journey. One has been sometimes the conflict you can have with the public. So I think leaders should lead, not be led. And don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean you shouldn't take account of public opinion. Of course, you absolutely should. But there was times when we really had to lead, contrary to sometimes the wishes and desires of the public. And the most obvious example of that I can think of just now is when I was health secretary in the middle of a global pandemic. I mean, I didn't get into politics to lock people into their houses and only be allowed to have one walk a day, right? That's not why I got into politics. And that was really difficult. And there was points where at the beginning of the pandemic, people understood it. But by the time you got to third or fourth lockdown, they were really upset. Business was really angry. But you did it, and we did it because we believed sincerely, and I think time has proven that to be the case, that we were trying to save as many lives as we possibly could. And that was the driving motivator. But you were at conflict sometimes with the public and with business, but you had to do what was right, and you had to lead and not be led in that case. Then the second area of conflict was often within government, and sometimes between governments. We'd devolved government in Scotland, and we'd have that, and this plays into your second part of your question in a minute, that with the UK government, we would have kind of conflict. They would want to do one thing, and often take the country in one direction, and we would want to take the country in a different direction, but they would hold the power because they would have the power reserved to them as part of the United Kingdom. And so there would be that kind of conflict. And Brexit would be an example of where Scotland voted to stay within the European Union. 62% voted to stay within the European Union. But because England voted to leave, and that being the larger part of the United Kingdom, the whole United Kingdom had to leave. So real conflict around that. But sometimes even within the Scottish government, there was conflict. I remember being Justice Secretary, and Scotland's prison population is far too high, still is. It's got the highest prison population per head of any Western European nation. And as Justice Secretary, I was trying to make the argument internally that, look, we should just ban sentences of 1 year or less because they're completely ineffectual. I mean, all of the peer-reviewed data tells you for rehabilitation, they have no impact whatsoever. Much better putting people into community rehabilitation. But I couldn't convince some of the more conservative elements in my own cabinet, and my colleague, the cabinet I was a part of, let alone the First Minister at the time, that was the right thing to do. We had to compromise eventually. And then the most difficult conflict I found was the personal. And so when I was First Minister, I'll give you an example, my in-laws were trapped in Gaza. So they went to Gaza. My wife is Palestinian. Her father born in Dirbala in Gaza. And they went to go visit my wife's grandmother, who was very frail, in her 90s at that point. And she caught COVID. And so they went on, I think it was October the 2nd. And of course, then October the 7th happened. And I remember waking up, and there was 38 messages on my wife's phone from her mother-in-law. My mother-in-law. And of course, everything, we found out what was going on October the 7th. And at some point during the day, I had to sit down with my wife as the First Minister of Scotland and say, I have to condemn what Hamas did for a dreadful terror attack. But in doing so, there may be a retaliation. Like they may choose to do something to your parents and your family, who are well known in Gaza, and everybody knows everybody in Gaza, really. And that was really hard, because she told me, forgive the language, but she said, I don't need a fucking First Minister, I need a husband. And so I delayed it by a day and got one of my cabinet secretaries to do it instead. But there was a really difficult conflict of personal and public. My public duty as well versus my personal duty as a husband, and as a father to my children who were practically mourning the fact they might lose their their granny and their cereal. And then the second part of your question, just very, very, very briefly, I think dialogue is crucial, and we were listening to Mani Shankar Arya, who's incredible diplomat over decades and decades, and he talks about the fact that dialogue has to be, it can't be interrupted, and has to be uninterruptible. And I think its personal relationships are also important, though. And I found that with the UK government. So I was often given the call by the First Minister's team or the Chief of Staff or senior advisors to say, look, you've got a really good relationship with, there was a UK minister, health minister called Sajid Javid, a Conservative, and we don't agree on much, to be honest, politically. They said, going to go speak to Javid to tell the UK government to stop being so stupid and sort this issue out, and we're going to send you in. And in the UK government, they would send Michael Gove, who was the UK government minister at the time, and in fact, we would say that we've just been goved. Right? We kind of used it in that kind of way, because we knew that he was being sent, because they wanted a kind of reasonable discussion with somebody that we could have an interpersonal relationship with. So I do actually think dialogue is crucial, because that mistrust you talk about that can come out of dialogue, I think that mistrust is even worse in a vacuum, and can be even worse in a vacuum. So I think if you're not having dialogue at all, through the even back channels and so on, then you're not even at the first stage. But those interpersonal relationships are often so crucial. Finding the people who can be honest brokers, I think, is crucial. In India-Pakistan's case, I don't know who the honest broker is. Right. It can't be the UK with the baggage the UK have. It can't be the US with the relationship with India at the moment. It can't be China with its strong, favourable relationship with Pakistan. So, who is the honest broker in that? I don't know.
Leo, I had told Humza a little bit as I was walking in the room that the Conflict Resolution Center that I work on, we do a lot of work on Israel-Palestine, but some of my predecessors did work years before, even before Good Friday on Northern Ireland, and we're connected with an organization in Northern Ireland called Community Dialogue that was trying to get people from different communities to talk. So there was a time when I would have assumed the answer to my question about the most intractable or difficult conflict would have been Ireland's relationship with the UK, but that's not necessarily true anymore. What have been the most difficult conflicts that you've had to manage?
Yeah, well, I often say people who, look to the example of Ireland as a conflict that is largely resolved, certainly no longer involves violence anymore. We're a good example to follow, but don't think we're so great. It took us 700 years. So our conflict was slightly more protracted than Israel-Palestine or even India-Pakistan, because the English arrived in 1156 or whenever it was, and that's when it all started. But I think picking up on the whole issue of dialogue, though, one thing Manny said yesterday, which really resonated with me, is that a very important part of dialogue is giving people the opportunity to get their grievances off their chest. You need to allow people to set out their position and their grievances. And they also need to feel heard. People like their day in court. So a really important part of dialogue is to actually allow people to list and express their grievances, and then to actively hear their grievance. That is really important. And that's not done enough. And it's not about correcting them or giving them a lecture about history. It's about giving people the space to list their grievances and make their case. And then the other thing that's really important and really valuable dialogue, I think, is it does help you to better understand the other person's position. And as human beings, we don't like moral ambiguity. We love to frame people as the good guys and the bad guys. And like goodies and baddies exist in fairy tales. In real life and real politics, it's all a grey area. And actually allowing dialogue to happen allows you to better understand the other person's position, and then potentially find common ground, and then potentially find compromise. And so much now plays out in the media and plays out in public. It's very hard to do that unless you can have a private space and a safe space in which that can be done. And as you said, in Ireland, long before the politicians agreed to get involved in talks, a lot was happening at civil society level. And that was valuable because it created the environment where I think politicians were more willing to have those talks. A lot of the time, politicians are afraid of losing their base by compromising. And we've seen that a lot happen. It certainly happens on the unionist side in Northern Ireland. Traditionally, the unionist leader who compromises gets removed. And you see that in Israel as well. The people who make the compromise often get removed.
Or assassinated.
Or assassinated.
Or assassinated.
Yeah.
And that happens across the world. But, and that's a fear people have. I could lose my life or lose my job if I upset my base. And what can be useful about that track to civil society, public dialogue and peacemaking is it can help to create a counterbalance to that. And we had, we had huge movements, huge protests in Ireland in the 1990s where ordinary people went out on the streets and demanded a ceasefire. And that's a little bit written out of history, I think, at the moment. Hopefully as things develop and we write that period of history a bit more, people will remember the Women's Coalition, they'll remember the Peace People, they'll remember the various different groups that were actually willing to, take to the streets, travel north, travel south, build connections and build dialogue, which I think was an important part of creating the environment for the peace process, where the political leaders were less afraid of losing their tribe if they were the ones who had to lead on their own.
So I'd like to shift the gear a little bit to India, Pakistan. When Love asked me to sit with you for this event, he told me we were going to have these distinguished senior government officials with incredible expertise on India and Pakistan. I went to the event yesterday. The accents were a little different than I had anticipated. But you, I think, very kind of prominently during the most recent eruption of violent armed conflict between India and Pakistan in 2025, the two of you authored an open, jointly written letter to the two prime ministers, Prime Ministers Modi and Sharif, calling for de-escalation and peace. And, I actually was not able to find the whole text. I found some media with some of the language. But one of the things I found interesting was there a reference here to saying we must resist division and reject hate. There is also a suggestion that the pathway of conflict may rouse national pride in the moment. And this triggered for me a question that I'd be interested in your thoughts on. In a university, when we study conflict, we're incredibly analytical about it. We think about the balance of power, we think about the strategic interests, we think about trading interests, we think about how to frame these in written documents, and yet I'm struck when you encounter those who are involved in real-world conflicts. And you talked about the importance of allowing people to vent. Emotion is very powerful. How much do you think emotion is a source of the conflict among India and Pakistan, and can you say something about where those grievances come from?
Yeah, but look, we're emotional beings. We're human beings. We're not artificial intelligence. We're real intelligence, and emotion and feelings is a huge part of that. Just even from my own experience, and I've been to India many times. I've never yet had the opportunity to go to Pakistan, but one of my grandaunts was a refugee from Sindh, abandoned their home at the time of partition, and became refugees in Maharashtra, in Mumbai. And why do I know that story when there are so many other family stories that I don't know? Because that scarred. That was a scar. So those emotions are there. The sectarian violence, partition, and then also the people who are left on either side of the border, and that's very much an issue in Ireland. When partition happened, there were minorities left on either side of the border and felt very abandoned by their respective sides. And then I think, particularly when something like a terrorist attack happens, whether it was the one in Kashmir, whether it was 9/11 here, that obviously invokes enormous emotion, but also invokes other things. Sometimes a desire for revenge, which is very dangerous, and but then also invokes defiance. One of the greatest speeches that I've ever heard made in the House of Commons was by Labour MP Tony Benn opposing the Iraq War, and he remembered his time. He was old enough to remember the Blitz and London being bombed, and he said that when Baghdad is bombed, will Arab women and Iraqi women not weep? And with every bomb that drops, will that not also strengthen their resolve? And I wonder now, in Iran, what's happening at the moment, and I don't know enough about Iran to comment on that in any detail, but my sense is the majority of people in Iran would like to be able to choose their own government, and perhaps a different one. But surely bombing their schools, bombing their infrastructure, is going to strengthen their resolve to want to defy this. And that's the power of human emotion.
Oh man, I think Leo has articulated it so eloquently as he often does. And storytelling is one of the most ancient art forms in the world, if not the most ancient art form in the world. And there's a reason for that. And I think for me, maybe a few things that when it comes to emotion, actually, although as human beings we're all nuanced in different ways, actually there's some things that we all crave, and safety, security, and peace has got to be quite high up there.
Maybe a little bit of dignity.
Yeah, dignity. And look, I remember kind of WhatsApping my brother-in-law in Gaza. He was a doctor in Al Nasser Hospital, pediatric surgeon, in fact. You can imagine the kind of things that he saw. In fact, you can't imagine, in truth, the things that he saw. And I remember one message from him, he had four young kids, and he was just saying, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, but he would just say to me in that message, I really just want my kids to have a normal, happy life. And now we've got him out, and he's in Canada, and she's gone from a pediatric surgeon to now working 3 days in a kebab shop, right? Because he has to make ends meet. But he doesn't care, of course. That's your point about dignity, actually. But he really just wants his kids to be happy, and he does whatever he's got to do to make his kids happy. And I think about India and Pakistan, and I think about two countries that could not be more similar. There's nobody more similar to Indians than Pakistanis, and there's nobody more similar to Pakistanis than Indians. We share a language. Hindi and Urdu, and the spoken tongue is pretty very, very, very similar, if not virtually the same. You've got sharing cuisine and culture, of course, as well as faith. 200 million Muslims in India, and many Sikhs and Hindus in Pakistan. So there is something about telling the story around what could be achieved if these two nations were able to cooperate and collaborate. Doesn't mean there doesn't have to be tension and grit, but we have to overcome the trauma, and the trauma is real in Pakistan. And this is why I think this was a point being made by a speaker yesterday. It might have been Manny himself, actually, that Mandela talked about a truth and reconciliation committee, putting truth first before reconciliation, and we have to create that space for that truth to come. And partition was bloody. Partition was violent. There was an orgy of violence. There was sexual violence, and all sides to blame. That violence took place against Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, and others. And then there's the issue of Kashmir, which you can't talk about resolve and conflict resolution between those two nations without talking about Kashmir. And the Irish and the Palestinians will tell you the British are very good at drawing a line in the map and then buggering off and letting other people deal with the consequences. But actually, creating that space, as Leo said, for people to speak their truth about the validity of their claim. But really, I think rooted in storytelling can be a positive. And actually, even when it comes to conflict and terror attacks, it will take a very brave set of politicians, and it has to be a set, one from either side, to take that tragedy to say, this has to be a moment that we turn. So nobody else, no other woman has to weep, no other family has to lose. Because the way things are going, all it is doing is breeding more hatred and more resentment, as opposed to the pathway to peace. And that's why I think this track 2 work that the Indo-Pak Dosti Forum is doing is so important.
Thanks. I'll ask one more question, and then we can open it up for some audience questions. And, as I think you've already surmised, because I'm hoping to get as much content in as possible, it's probably going to be a 2-part question. The center that I run focuses on intractable political conflicts, but we're interested in conflicts where for an outsider, it's possible to identify a solution that would make not just one of the parties to the conflict, but both of the parties better off. There would be what the economists would call a Pareto improving outcome. But the parties themselves can't reach that solution. So if you're an economist at that point, your head should be exploding, right? Because people are basically behaving irrationally. And we've been spending decades trying to figure out what are the barriers that stand in the way of parties reaching agreements, outcomes, solutions that would leave them better off than they are remaining in a state of conflict. And so I guess my two-part question for you is, do you think that the conflict between India and Pakistan is one in which there is a solution that would make both sides better off than they are remaining in a state of conflict? And if so, what stands in the way of them reaching an agreement that would improve their circumstances?
I'm curious to know, though, what is the solution that you see that is so obvious that both sides...
Well, so I don't purport to be an expert on India-Pakistan, so that is a genuine question. Is there a solution that would make them better off? Because for some conflicts, there is no such solution. And
because, if you ask about Israel-Palestine, you'd be talking about going back to the two-state solution, which we were close to at certain points in time. And of course, the issue there really is lack of trust. From Ramallah, you can see the towers of Tel Aviv. There's a lack of trust from the Israeli side that a Palestinian state wouldn't be used to attack them. There's a lack of trust from the Palestinian side that they wouldn't be overrun again, or that their state wouldn't be a real one. That Israel would still seek to control it. I think with India-Pakistan, it's less clear to see what the solution is. Maybe there is one that I haven't seen. But anyway, I might come back to this. Let Humza answer the rest.
Yeah, I can. Just give my thoughts. And by the way, I'm also not an expert in India and Pakistan. I have an interest in it and read history, and we have some heritage, so I can give you some thoughts. But again, I'll go back to Maniji, who was speaking yesterday. He said, and again, decades worth of experience as a diplomat in that region, friendships across India and Pakistan, said if we can resolve the Kashmir issue, everything, and this is his words, everything else is, quote unquote, child's play. So in terms of the Kashmir issue, there are many conflicts over land and territory that have been resolved and are able to be resolved over time. And we've seen it in our lifetimes, let alone before our lifetimes. And I don't propose to say what that structure should be. I mean, I personally think that has to be grounded in what the Kashmiri people want, right, and a plebiscite and a referendum. But what structure they want and how that governance structure should look, should not be insurmountable or beyond the wit of man and women to be able to come to a resolution around territory and land. And we can have some red lines, and we should say, look, again, I think Maniji spoke to us well yesterday, that you might not want to exchange territory, or there be a mass migration of people, because we know what happened in that region when that happened almost 8 decades ago. So I think that's one thing. In terms of what's preventing that, there is the individual self-interest versus the nation self-interest. So just take Pakistan, just take the economic point that you were asking about. So if there was a good trading relationship between India and Pakistan, it would asymmetrically benefit Pakistan, right? India is the 5th largest growing economy, fifth largest, fastest growing economy. Pakistan is really struggling economically. It's thought that the trade and the formal trade, which is currently zero between the two nations, would be up to $20 billion US. So economically, you can make the argument. Now, if you're an army chief in Pakistan, if you don't have conflict with nuclear-armed India, and you're not glaring over the mountains at your enemy, then is there really an excuse to increase your defense budget, as Pakistan did, by 20%? Can you really afford to spend over $10 billion US on defense for the army? And so do some people in the country have a vested interest? And how do you defeat that? Goodness, that is the $1 million or maybe even $20 billion question.
Yeah, 20 billion as it turns out. Well, let's open up for our questions, but that is one of the things that we do focus on, is this tension between, or the combination between intergroup conflict and intra-group dynamics. And you often have people who would be opposed to a resolution. They can become spoilers. they can become barriers to what would be good for their community as a whole. But questions, we have students who are facilitating. I think we're asking speakers to kind of go to the mics that are here in the stairwells.
I'm happy to take a few questions at a time. You can try to divvy them up. Even if time is an issue.
Okay.
I'll leave that to you.
All right, if you just want to say your name and where you're from.
Hi, my name is Nathan. I'm from San Diego originally, and I'm studying, hopefully, political science and history. Thank you guys so much for coming today. I really appreciate you guys sharing your opinion. I guess I have two questions. One is more serious and one is more fun. I think for the first one, I'm a little curious how you guys managed to stay strong in situations where people in your countries might have believed your culture and your viewpoints to be a bit of a threat. As an Asian American, I'm a Chinese American. I've unfortunately dealt with a lot of instances of racism and bigotry, but more often incidents of ignorance or misunderstanding. So I'm curious how you guys managed to flourish and still prosper with all that going on. As the second question is for First Minister Yousaf. I'm just a little curious why the position of Deputy First Minister isn't called the Second Minister. It just seems to be a bit more like logical in that sense. But yeah, I'm curious. I'm just curious. Yeah.
Do you want to take just one question?
Let's do it for now, and then we can group them as we get more jammed on time.
Sure. Thank you for that. Look, on the second question, I'll take it back to the First Minister. It's not my problem anymore, what the titles are. I would also say on your first question, which is a really important one, I mean, particularly with the proliferation of social media as we have seen it over the years, the level of abuse for anybody entering politics, particularly if you're a person of colour, and by the way, particularly if you're a woman of colour, is exponentially off the scale, and it is awful. And I'm afraid it gets worse. I mean, I at that time when I was dealing with everything about my in-laws being in Gaza, also had the world's wealthiest man decide to take to Twitter and call me, I think in his words, quote unquote, a super racist. I mean, self-projection if ever I saw it, I have to say. But you know, he decided, and that unleashed a whole new level of abuse, threat, and so on that we had to deal with. Now, your question is, how do you deal with it? I think it's the truth of it from my perspective. I obviously can't speak for Leo, but the truth of it from my perspective is, of course, you can take measures to protect yourself. So I don't look at notifications, come on X or Instagram. You know, have the settings that you don't look at that stuff. Why would I? Sometimes it'd be tough because I'd have to speak to my mum because she would phone me up and say, "Oh, I saw that Facebook post and that comment. Why are people so nasty?" I'd say, "Mum, if you search my name one more time on X," I had to get my sister to speak to her. And, you know, but then the truth of the matter also is that you should never, as a politician, grow such a thick skin that you become completely impervious to empathy or emotion. Because I think that's what makes a very good leader, is empathy, and to a point even vulnerability. And I know we're living in the era of kind of strong men, but I would argue that that's not the best model. There should be strength at times, of course, but you shouldn't be so impervious. And I think if somebody said to me, I got all this hatred, all this abuse, rape threats against my wife, death threats against my children, but it didn't affect me in the slightest, I would really question that person's kind of mentality to lead.
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly right. Look, you got to have a thick skin if you're going to be in politics. It's not a place for people who are sensitive or people who are easily upset. Although you can become the president of America for some reason, but generally speaking,
that's your visa gone.
Generally speaking, it's you do have to have a thick skin, and but also yeah, don't become desensitized. That's actually a real risk, and I would have got on two fronts: homophobia and then also racism. And indeed, the richest person in the world decided to tell X that I hated the Irish.
That's right.
So we so many shared experiences.
Was that not recent as well?
No,
it was
enough
something
time.
recent.
Enough time. And I largely ignored it too. And actually, to a certain extent, it gave me a bit of strength because I was never given in to those people. I wouldn't let them beat me down.
Let's go ahead and go here, and then here we'll take two questions, although I will realize now I'm feeling a little sorry for myself because the richest man in the world hasn't said shit about me.
Thank you. My name is Joshua. I'm from Marin County, grew up here, but I'm also half British and a citizen of both countries. And so I feel very strongly about the state of politics in both and around the world. I follow the politics of the US and the UK more closely. I assume, from what I see in global headlines, that it's the same in Ireland, but democracy is facing a seemingly once in a several lifetimes sort of existential crisis at the moment. We mentioned our president and Elon Musk in so many words, and with Nigel Farage, and I'm sure Ireland has its own sort of brand of rising neoconservatism. And I'm curious, simply, how you see today's theme of conflict, dialogue, and bridge building affecting the supports, institutions, frameworks that keep democracy strong in your countries.
Okay, and let's go ahead and do one other one. We'll take two at a time.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Daniel. I'm an undergraduate here. I'm from Boston, Massachusetts. Honestly, don't entirely know what I'm going to study. I had two questions, so I guess whichever one you would prefer to answer would be incredible. My first question is, First Minister, to your point about like Kashmir and sort of looking at what the Kashmir people want, I'm wondering if you think that framework can be applied to other sort of contested territories across the world, but then also considering other factors, like, so for instance, Hong Kong and China, you have a historical, you have a colonial component, sort of how these different factors factor into when we're considering these contested territories. And then my second question is in terms of sort of this entire project that we have today, which is sort of debate and discussion about these issues. It seems like in many cases, Israel-Gaza is a great example. I think both of you spoke to this a little bit, but that people with sort of strong, like very strong hardline opinions tend to attract a lot of support. And it seems that people are attracted to them in some cases because there's this impression that they can get things done. And so I'm curious how you sort of build an effective sort of coalition in that sense while still maintaining that dialogue. Yeah. Thank you.
Great set of questions.
Great set of questions. So, Leo, you want to start here?
I might start with Josh's question on the democracy front, and I'm not sure I can answer well, but it is a real concern that I share. I'm the generation that saw the Berlin Wall fall in 1989, and at that time we believed that democracy was going to sweep the world and was going to become the normal form of government in all of the world. And we saw that happen in Central and Eastern Europe, where in most cases we have viable functioning democracies. But there were free and fair elections in Russia. There was Tiananmen Square in China. We thought democracy there would come about inevitably at some point. Turkey, to a lesser extent, India, in lots of places we're seeing democracy in retreat. And then when we do surveys of people, including young people, increasing numbers of people taking the view that democracy does not serve their interests, and increasing numbers of people who take the view that we need a benevolent leader or a strong man who can sort things out for us. And that's actually a real worry. What can you do to counteract it? I think strong institutions, courts, parliaments, civil society, unions, business groups, all those things, building them up is really important. The media and the free press, including public service media, you can definitely see a huge difference in countries that have a strong public service media against ones that is entirely owned by a certain number of people or very wealthy people. We'll have to do something, I think, around the proper regulation of information. I don't like that, but there's so much misinformation now that it's very hard to find trusted sources of information. And then I think the most obvious thing is dealing with so many of the underlying injustices in the world that cause people to lose faith in the systems that they have around them. And I know in my country, and it's probably true here as well, the cost and unaffordability of housing, rents being high, and younger people not believing it's ever realistic for them to own their own home, is causing an enormous intergenerational divide, which is causing people to doubt that the system works at all for them. So they'd be the four elements that I think I'd be focusing on.
Not terribly much to add. Look, I think the point about democracy, one of the reasons I think the threat to democracy is real is not just because of the rise of the far right, though I do think that's an important factor. The rise of the far right do not care for democracy. It's not their leading principle, or it's not a motivator or a drive for them to preserve democracy, enhance democracy. In fact, quite the opposite. They'd be quite keen and quite happy, I think, to do away with democracy if it meant that they could continue with power. But those of us who have been in government also have to take some real responsibility about the fact that where there hasn't been adequate delivery, then people will go, well, let's take the United Kingdom, where in the last 15 years now, we've seen the largest single drop in living standards since records began. And so people are saying to me, 20 years ago, my life felt better. I had more income, I could go on more holidays, we could afford more, the heating bill wasn't as high, the mortgage wasn't as high, I could afford a house, my kids could afford, et cetera, et cetera. And so if people are saying, look, in 20 years, my life is worse, markedly, and I can feel it, then why should I put my faith in democracy and not put my faith in that guy who says he can resolve the issue? And because, by the way, all of you, Labour, SNP, Conservative, we've had all of you, and my life is worse. So you know what, I'm going to take a punt on that guy, even if I don't agree with everything. And of course, in the day and age we live in, when you can articulate sound bites with creativity, and as long as there's a kernel of truth in there, which there often is, there's a kernel of truth in there, then actually it will resonate with people. I think that's the danger. By the way, sorry, to give you a solution, part solution, hope is a big motivator. So fear is, of course, but hope can also win, and we've had examples of that. Leo was articulating some examples of where hope, people who've kind of brought forward an alternative across the European continent, whether it be in Poland or the Netherlands, or even in the United Kingdom. We had a by-election recently near Manchester, Gorton and Denton, and the Greens won that by-election. It's a very hopeful message in comparison to a very dark and dystopian message from Nigel Farage's party. So hope can win, and we need politicians to bring back a little bit of that, I suppose, as one president here said, the audacity of hope. Yeah,
I can't remember your question. Sorry.
I can remember. So let me just reference them because I remember them. I think the plebiscite issue, or
yes.
Can that help to resolve? Yes. Look, it's not just a single transferable that you have a plebiscite and everything is resolved. And in fact, often that can cause significant issues and problems in itself. But there is a right to determine your own self and your own future that every country should have. And people of Hong Kong, as you say, significant history there with the British and with the Chinese. But ultimately, it should be for the people of Hong Kong to determine what kind of system of government they wish to have. The second part of your question was, the kind of more extreme political elements. Is that right?
Yeah, and then how when you conduct this sort of democracy, this civil engagement, how you sort of translate that into action when it seems like many of the more hardline leaders that you were referencing, one of their appeals is that they can get things done, or at least...
Yeah. So I think it just goes back to my point about service delivery, and this is where being in San Francisco is so important, where actually governments, I don't think, in Europe, and certainly not in the United Kingdom, including the government I was a part of, we're just not embracing AI as a tool for better public service delivery. We have huge waiting lists in the NHS. To get a doctor's appointment in Scotland, you have to phone the GP at 8 in the morning, you're number 24 in the queue, and they call you back at 4 p.m. and tell you to cancel all your work meetings the next day in order to come in and see the GP. And it's just not an efficient system. And you have all these different, you have hundreds of general practice, doctors' practices that have their own back-end systems. Now, AI could sit a layer above that and be able to streamline that and create the app that we don't have in Scotland, which will allow me to, if I can control my heating from thousands of miles away here in San Francisco on my phone, why on earth can I not book a doctor's appointment? And like somebody who has very no coding ability and is not particularly tech savvy, I've got an app created for my transition out of politics because I was able to use an AI tool to be able to assist. So government public service delivery, I think, has to be at the heart of that. And using the tools that we have available, that should be easier now than ever before.
I think just on the first part of that, I strongly believe that borders shouldn't be changed by force, whether it's in Ukraine or anywhere else. And I do believe in the right of self-determination of people, and that's best expressed in a plebiscite. But plebiscites can be terribly complicated. If there was a plebiscite in Kashmir, for example, do the people in Leh and Ladakh have the right to have a different decision? And we saw that develop, of course, in Ireland, where there was a consensus for independence except in the northeast, or even in Britain with Brexit, where there was a vote for Brexit but not in Scotland. So they come with side effects.
Yeah.
Let's take a couple more. We'll do one here and one here.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. I've really appreciated your talk. I'm Ramon. I'm an undergrad in political theory. Something that First Minister Yousaf mentioned was that you believe that leaders should lead and not be led. And I was just wondering if both of you might be willing to talk about a situation in which public participation changed your course of action in governance, and how a strong, informed, and empowered civil society was able to meaningfully kind of shape decision-making, and what were the kind of the characteristics of those kind of advocacy efforts or individuals or civil society organizations that allowed their voice to ultimately get to you as a decision maker.
Our students are very smart.
Hi, my name is Shanika. I'm a pediatrician actually at the Children's Hospital here at Stanford. And so I wanted to ask, as a former physician and as a former health secretary, what role do you see for people in the healthcare field to play in addressing global conflict and in kind of making dialogue more accessible, especially given that many of us as healthcare professionals are often told that we should be not political or very neutral, because we obviously want to treat everyone equally, but that's oftentimes been used as a way to keep us out of politics or out of addressing conflict.
Well, that question seems particularly well suited for you, Leo. No?
Yeah, well, I don't know. It's one of those I'd have to give a bit more thought to. I don't know if there's a specific role for doctors and pediatricians. I think everyone has a role, whether it's teachers or lawyers or business people. So I don't know if there is a specific role for doctors and healthcare workers, but I'd certainly be very opposed to the idea that you should sort of stay out of it. Certainly from my experience, the people who've been last to leave the field are very often the healthcare workers. Organizations like Médecins Sans Frontières are the last ones still there when all the government employees are gone. And I know one thing that people who work in healthcare can speak about very authoritatively is the reality of the injuries that you see. And I worked in emergency medicine for a while. I know what gunshot wounds look like. I know what dismembered wounds look like. And anyone who thinks that there's any sort of glory or romance in war, they should just spend some time in the trauma room. For some people, it's a fate worse than death, the kind of injuries that you endure from explosives and from violence. And I think that's an area where I think doctors and physicians can speak very authoritatively. On your question, I'll only give one example where it did really work for us. We did a number of citizens' assemblies in Ireland, which I had mixed feelings about, and there's pluses and minuses, but essentially we took 100 people randomly selected from the population who were willing to give up a few weekends to discuss an issue and make recommendations to Parliament. Parliament did not have to accept the recommendations, but had to consider them. And one of the questions that we put to the Citizens' Assembly was around the liberalisation of our abortion laws, which were very strict at the time, only allowed abortion where there was a threat to the life of the mother. And my original plan was the incremental approach, that we would liberalise the laws a bit. We'd go for hard cases, statutory rape, rape, incest, medical conditions and so on. And after those ordinary citizens had heard all the arguments and teased them out, they recommended that we go further and that we liberalise our abortion laws to a greater extent than I had intended to do. And that kind of gave me the confidence that if we had to put this to a plebiscite, and we did under our constitution, we actually had a good enough chance of winning the argument. And that was just one example.
Such a great example, actually, to give. And on the healthcare worker, so if I just take the issue of kind of what's been happening in Gaza, which, by the way, I have no doubt in my mind at all that it's a genocide that's ongoing there, that some of the most powerful voices have been from doctors who've travelled out there and from the doctors that are in Gaza themselves. And I think with healthcare workers, you continue to have trust and authority in a way that sometimes politicians absolutely don't. In fact, we sometimes breed mistrust. But physicians, doctors are trusted, often trusted worldwide. So I think that voice and reporting and bearing witness to what is happening is exceptionally important in A&E rooms or trauma that you're witnessing. I mean, hugely powerful. And you know, when again, if I'm just giving you the example of doctors when they're talking about the horrific scenes that they've seen, they're also very important evidential basis. So when it comes to the issue of genocide, though I believe it to be a genocide, there will of course have to be a court determination at one point of whether it's a genocide or not by the ICJ, and the testimony of doctors and healthcare workers will be so important in trying to make that determination. It will not be the only factor, but one of the factors in that determination. On the issue, I think Leo's just given such a good example, but if I gave you one perhaps, one and a half. One was when I was Justice Secretary, I met with a group of rape survivors, and they had told me how the justice system had re-traumatized them, with one survivor telling me that she felt that she was raped for a second time, but by the justice system. It was a really, and forgive me, I know, very sensitive topic to talk about. And in Scotland, we had 3 verdicts. We had guilty, not guilty, and not proven.
Yeah.
And it was so many rape survivors would tell us that when not proven, which was often the verdict that was discharged, they said they felt a crushing blow of injustice, which to a lot of people said, we think that man is guilty of raping you, we just can't quite prove it or can't quite meet the evidential base, so we'll just go with not proven. And they would feel that the jury believed that they were raped, but they just let the person go. And so that really traumatized them. So it was a tough legal fight. I wasn't sure about whether taking on that legal fight because the whole legal establishment, the Scottish justice system is hundreds of years old, entrenched in history and tradition. I'm very proud of that legal tradition, which is very distinct to the English legal system. But it was that conversation with that very small group, so not like a citizens' assembly, but actually a very small round table of around 15 women who spoke unbelievably powerfully and made me have the confidence to go to that cabinet table and convince my colleagues, sorry, it wasn't my cabinet, my colleagues around that cabinet table that this was the right thing to do, even though the whole weight of the legal system in Scotland would come down raining against us. And ultimately, although I moved on to a different portfolio, that change was made by my successor in the justice system, but it came from that conversation with a small group that led us to make what I think is a fundamental change in our legal system.
We're running quite low on time. What I would like to do, though, is to just give everybody who's still at the queue a chance to ask their question. If you could kind of do it, in the kind of the pithy version, and then maybe we'll just pick one of them for our response, since we probably won't have time. So let's go ahead and go here.
Hi, my name is Anurag. I'm a local resident. I've been interested in politics and current events for a long time when I was young, but not as young as you were. My question is about India and Pakistan. Do you think Prime Minister Modi's anti-Muslim rhetoric is hindering chances of, bridge building between the two nations? And then looking to the future, statistics say that the Muslim population is increasing in India faster than the Hindu population. Do you think that'll help, improve relations between the two countries? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Zahid Pervez. I'm a Fulbright scholar at University of California in Davis. I'm from Pakistan. So India-Pakistan relations since partition have been strained for most part. However, we saw that there were phases where things improved. For instance, immediately after Kargil, Vajpayee, Musharraf earlier this century, they came very close to finding something feasible for both countries. However, given the far right and the power dynamics in Pakistan, far right political narrative in India, and all that jingoistic rhetoric and chest thumping and nationalism, and given your own background of your personal heritage and the fact that you have led two nations which have been in conflict for most part in history in Ireland and Scotland, if you were to make decisions for India and Pakistan respectively, hypothetically but realistically, given the socio-political and power dynamics, how would you go about it? What are top 2-3 things that you two of you would do? Thank you.
Wow. Just nice, easy ones to end.
Yeah, so we don't want to answer that one.
I'll take the first one. You take the second one.
So that third one to come. So.
Hi, I'm Pauline. I'm an undergraduate studying international relations. So in a sense, it's easy to say that the conflict in in Northern Ireland has been resolved with the Good Friday Agreement. However, when I go to Ireland and I hear stories of Ireland jerseys being burned outside of fontaines and kneecap concerts, or orange parties in Bengal being the building was burned down the next day. So with regard to these kind of continuous conflict, even though it's it's not exactly the Troubles anymore, how do people and politicians with places that have these historic conflicts address the continuation of these conflicts beyond the actual peace agreements? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think just on the first one, short answer, yes. I had two uncles who were imprisoned by the British in India for fighting for independence and fighting for freedom, and they're recognized by the Indian government as freedom fighters. And the India that they fought for was a secular state, in which everyone would be equal regardless of their background or caste or religious beliefs. And that's something I believe in Ireland as well. Our 1937 constitution gave a special position to the Catholic Church, and that was removed. So people's faith should be respected, and people should be free to practice their religion, but not to impose their religion on other people through the laws of the state. I'm very much against that. So the short answer would be yes on that. Perhaps on the third one, full reconciliation is very difficult to achieve, and sectarianism still exists in Ireland. And I know there are people in Ireland who often say that we can't have unification until there's full reconciliation, and I say actually, when do you ever think that will really happen? Is the United States still fully reconciled after the Civil War? And that was in 1860 something. So actually achieving full reconciliation can be very difficult, may not always be possible. But I think if there's one fundamental thing that I would like to see happen in Northern Ireland in particular, is integrated education. Kids still go to separate schools. It's one thing to go to separate churches, play different sports, and read different newspapers, but to actually go to different schools, I think is a real problem. And one of the unfulfilled aspects of the Good Friday Agreement is that we have a cold peace. People often still live in separate areas, go to separate schools, still have peace walls, and it should be our decision collectively that within the next 10, 20 years that ends.
So yes, I do think the Hindutva movement, which is being encouraged by Prime Minister Modi, is a big problem, but I wouldn't say that the problem entirely lies at India's door. Of course that's a problem and a challenge. I think, and this maybe relates to Zahid's question, which Leo skillfully avoided. But
I don't know the answer.
I'm not going to suggest I know the answer, but as a segue to that question, is that I think in Pakistan, the army we know the army are the de facto rulers. And I think the army is far too strong. And don't get me wrong, the army has an important role to play, of course, in the defense of Pakistan. It also has an important role to play as a protector of Pakistan, and they've done that over decades, in some cases very, very, very well and robustly. But they have too much political power. And there are examples of countries where the army has been, I wouldn't call it weakened in that sense, but not been allowed to play that political role. For example, in Turkey, we've seen over the last, and again, I'm not suggesting that Pakistan do everything that President Erdogan has done at all. But I'm saying there are examples where the army has now no longer able to play the same political role that it has. And I don't think army should play a political role. I think they should play a defensive role in your nation state. So that's one of the things I would definitely seek to do. In Pakistan's case as well, I have to say, and in India's case, I think about the kind of Congress party in particular, I don't have much truck for dynastic politics. I have to say, in Pakistan we have the Sharifs and then the Bhuttos, then that kind of dynasty in Pakistan, and Imran Khan being a perhaps exception to that in recent years. And in India, as I say, with the kind of Congress party, we've had that dynastic politics. And although they're in opposition and have been for many years, I think that is also a real big significant problem and probably a barrier to peace, because over the years you kind of inherit your family's biases and your family's entrenched kind of beliefs, and sometimes you need fresh thinking. Maybe I'll end on that point, because I've been really pleased to meet so many students over the last 24, 40 hours from Pakistan and India who both told me that once they finished from Stanford and maybe accumulated some wealth through their wonderful startups and businesses that they're going to do, that actually their desire is to go back to Pakistan and India and to be involved in the politics there, to make a difference and to help to build that peace. And I wish you every luck with that.
Well, we have come to the end of our time. I would just like to say it's been a remarkable tour d'horizon of issues from Northern Ireland to Scotland to India and Pakistan and even Glasgow football. But I think one of the questions that I would have invited our speakers to address is what advice would you give to students who hope to become bridge builders and peacemakers? But I think they've modeled this through their own behavior and conduct and remarks. And maybe we could just take that away, this commitment to human dignity, caring for improving the lives of their constituents and focusing on these fundamental human dynamics that ultimately lie at the bottom of this. And also listening to what they wrote in their joint letter to the Indian and Pakistani prime ministers. We must resist division and reject hate. Let your solidarity with your country of origin never come at the expense of peace with your neighbors where you live. And so I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking our speakers for having come a long way.